Welcome to the Global News Podcast on YouTube, where we go behind the headlines to find out more about a story and why it matters. Today, we're focusing on Venezuela, where in a dramatic operation on Saturday, US troops seized the president, Nicolás Maduro, from the capital, Caracas. He's appearing in court in New York on drugs charges. Meanwhile, back in Venezuela, his vice president, Delcy Rodríguez, is being sworn in as his interim successor. We're joined in the studio by our South America correspondent, Ione Wells. Ione, how did we get here?
Well, for months and months and months, the US has been sending this huge military deployment to the region, and it has been ramping up the pressure on Venezuela, carrying out these strikes on alleged drug trafficking vessels, seizing oil tankers, making direct threats to the Venezuelan government. There was a lot of speculation that the US was trying to pressure Nicolás Maduro to step down. And many speculated that it was planning to escalate this further, to plan strikes within Venezuela itself. I think what took many people by surprise was when those strikes came on Saturday targeting military infrastructure in the country. Not only were many sites within and around Caracas hit, but of course also Nicolás Maduro himself seized, taken from the country in this dramatic exit. This is a man who for years held such a tight grip on power in the country, controlled all the state institutions. And I think Venezuelans are looking on in total shock, disbelief now at the images that we're seeing of President Maduro in his prison outfit, being taken by armed US officials from a detention center to a courthouse. It is an extraordinary fall from power for him. And of course, the US's justification for this is that they allege he is the head of this criminal trafficking organization in the country, that he has been conspiring to commit narco-terrorism, to import cocaine to the US, that he possesses weapons, charges that he has denied, but which the US is using as justification for this extraordinary action.
The US is using that justification, but President Trump has also used another word, and it's a word which very much chimes with the skeptics. That word, of course, is oil. How big a role is oil playing in all of this?
A major role. Venezuela had long accused the US of just wanting to steal its oil, saying that was the real reason why the US was ramping up military pressure on Venezuela.
And is it?
And Trump has essentially admitted this. He has said that now the US wants to get US oil companies into the country, that it wants to develop the resource further. He said this will enrich not just Venezuelans, but also Americans too. And Trump is framing this as taking back oil that was stolen from the US. Now, what I think he is referring to there is the fact that there used to be more US oil companies operating in Venezuela, many of which left when the industry was nationalized under Nicolás Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez. And he seems to be saying that this is essentially the US taking some of that back, given that some of those contracts were terminated early. Some companies lost out on millions and millions of dollars of compensation. However, of course, Venezuela would strongly dispute that nationalization equates to stealing, the language that Donald Trump has used. So this is a heavily contested claim that the US is making. But certainly they have basically said the quiet bit out loud. They have very much themselves now made this about oil. Which is, as you say, is something that for a long time skeptics of the US had been saying this was really about.
Yes, although Donald Trump is also trying to frame this as a win-win, because it would be hard to say the oil was used for the general benefit of the population under Nicolás Maduro. Life under Nicolás Maduro for a lot of Venezuelans was really miserable. What are the majority of Venezuelans thinking now?
Well, the feeling is mixed. If we're to take what the opposition say was the real result in the 2024 election, the last presidential election, we understand that the majority of the country was not in favour of Nicolás Maduro's government. He still does have some loyal supporters, but much of the country were deeply unhappy, deeply fearful of him and his government. There was widespread repression, many political prisoners. The economy was in a complete mess. There were severe shortages, a humanitarian crisis, access to certain medicines, for example, extreme extremely difficult. Millions of Venezuelans have fled in recent years as a result. So there are many people who privately are very happy that Maduro is gone. Although even among, I think, those critics of Maduro, there are sort of mixed feelings. Some hope that this is a moment of freedom, that this is a moment where they may now see a path to a more democratic and more free Venezuela. Others, though, I think are quite apprehensive about what comes next, especially because for now, the government is still very much filled with Maduro's allies. There isn't really regime change yet. The only change to the government has been the removal of Nicolás Maduro. And so I think some Venezuelans are a bit worried about what exactly happens now. Is there going to be more repression? Are there going to be sort of bitter power struggles that might break out if, for example, the current government is forced to do the US's bidding? Will that cause some of the Maduro loyalists to rebel against the government and cause some power struggles? And then what about the opposition? What do opposition figures make of that, if so? And what about some of the paramilitaries, the military itself? Where will they eventually stand on all of this? So I think there are a lot of questions leading, as I say, even some critics of Maduro to feel quite unsettled, really, about the situation.
And it is interesting, this relationship that seems to be developing between the White House and the acting president, Delcy Rodríguez. She was, of course, Nicolás Maduro's vice president. She's now got her hands on the levers of power. Tell us about her. Who is she? And is she someone who could still be running the country in a year, 2 years?
Yeah, so she's now the interim president, but she is nobody new to Venezuelan politics. She's a lawyer. She rose up the ranks under Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and then under Maduro. She was communications minister, foreign affairs minister at a time when sanctions were imposed on the country. She then later became Maduro's vice president, but also his oil minister. So she's been responsible for that industry. It's been in her portfolio, giving her huge power over the country's economy and oil industry. And her brother Jorge is president of the National Assembly, so she's deeply embedded, as is her family, in the Venezuelan government. What's really interesting about her relationship with the US is that the US has claimed that she's had conversations with Marco Rubio, for example, and the US is claiming that she would, in theory, work with them, that she is prepared to take on what is necessary to, in Trump's words, make Venezuela great again. Now, we've heard very conflicting statements over the last couple of days, because she publicly has said that what the US has done is terrible, that Maduro is the only legitimate president, that Venezuela is prepared to fight and defend itself. But then we heard her soften her tone somewhat and say that she wants the US to cooperate within the realms of international law, a suggestion there that she is open to working with the US. And Donald Trump, I think, has made it clear why that might be. He has said, essentially, that if Delcy Rodríguez doesn't do, in his words, the right thing, which I think we can read to mean what he wants, then she could face the same fate, if not worse, than Maduro. So I think she will be acutely aware that even though she is now in charge of the country, she has this threat hanging over her that if she doesn't do as the US wants, she could well face exactly the same fate, as could many of the other ministers who are still in power in the country.
There are questions over whether the US action was legal. How much of a talking point is that in Venezuela? And actually, what happens if the conclusion is that it wasn't legal?
Yeah, it's a huge talking point, not just in Venezuela, but actually the whole of Latin America right now. And that's because I think it is worth stressing that even though, as I say, many in Venezuela, but also many in South America more generally, didn't like Nicolás Maduro, there is a deep unease about US intervention, and that is partly because many in Latin America remember, for example, throughout the 20th century, the times when the US backed military coups to impose more favourable governments in countries around Latin America. They remember the repression, the human rights abuses that were associated with some of those periods, even in countries like Brazil and Argentina and Chile as well. And I think that does leave many people deeply skeptical about the US's intervention. And even some Venezuelans I've spoken to who are, as I say, not fans of Maduro, are skeptical that the US is, in the words of some of them, just trying to steal our oil, trying to steal our resources. There are some who support President Trump, notably the diaspora in the US, particularly in places like Florida, that are traditionally much more sympathetic to President Trump, to the idea of US intervention. But I would say that it's not as simple as saying that just because Maduro has been removed and many people don't like him, that they, by definition, also back what Donald Trump is doing. The question of legality is an interesting one because the US is framing this as law enforcement. They're saying that this was them executing an arrest warrant, essentially, that was out against Nicolás Maduro. Many lawyers, though, think that is a huge stretch to claim that you can essentially conduct strikes on a sovereign country, that you can grab a leader and drag him out of the country as a way to enact law enforcement, essentially. And that is what is leading many lawyers to question the legality of this. The general consensus among most lawyers is that this is also a flagrant breach of the UN conventions that govern warfare around the world, many saying that this amounts to breaking the law of aggression. The US, though, denies this. They say this is self-defense. But I think to sort of for that argument to wash legally, they would have to provide some kind of evidence that they were seriously at risk of an attack on their sovereignty by Venezuela.
Yeah, and to briefly follow on from that, I mean, this action does send a very strong message to the leaders that Donald Trump doesn't get on with around the world, but specifically in the region. How would you be feeling if you were the president of Colombia today?
I think pretty terrified. I think Trump has, not just through veiled threats, but very explicit threats, hinted that Colombia could be next, that Cuba could be next. He's told the leaders of those countries to, well, he's used ruder language than I will, but said to watch their backs, essentially. And he's accused, for example, Gustavo Petro, Colombia's president, of being involved in drug trafficking, something that he's denied. And I think, there are elections coming up this year in Colombia. I think it is almost guaranteed that President Trump will try to influence those, at least through his rhetoric, if not through his actions. He is very much, I think, signalling with what he has done in Venezuela that, regardless of international law, he feels he can use force to influence essentially events in his backyard in a way that many will remember from the 20th century has been done by the US in the past.
Ione, thank you. Ione Wells, our South America correspondent. To find out more about this story, do tune into the Global News podcast wherever you get your BBC podcasts. You can subscribe to us here on YouTube. And if you have an idea for a story that you think we should be covering here, do leave a message in the comments below.